A junior employee can now produce work that looks experienced much earlier than it used to. If you're 5 or 8 years into a white-collar career, that changes what your experience is competing with. But polished output, actual learning, and career progression are 3 different outcomes. The research is starting to show how far apart those outcomes can become. That matters because experience was never just the number of years beside your job title. It was the hundreds of small decisions you made before anyone trusted you with the large ones. An analyst learned by building models that broke, then finding out why they broke. A consultant learned by watching a clean deck collide with a messy client meeting. A developer learned by tracing failures that a more experienced engineer could have fixed much faster. Those repetitions looked inefficient precisely because teaching someone is often inefficient. Remove the repetition, and you may remove drudgery. Remove the wrong repetition, and you may also remove part of the learning system. A career ladder is partly a learning system disguised as a staffing chart. The strongest case for the optimistic version comes from a real customer support workplace. During a rollout beginning in late 2020, researchers followed 5,172 agents as an AI assistant entered their workflow. The system suggested responses during live customer conversations, while the agents remained responsible for what they sent. Across the workplace, access raised issues, resolved per hour, by about 15% on average. But the average wasn't the most interesting result. The biggest gains went to the less experienced and lower-performing workers. Agents with roughly 2 months of tenure and assistance performed about as well as untreated agents with more than 6 months. In that setting, part of the measured experience curve compressed dramatically. A newer worker could reach competent-looking performance much earlier than the old tenure curve suggested. For a company, that can shorten the time before a new employee becomes productive. For someone already several years into a career, it changes what the first layers of experience visibly buy. Speed and competent first-pass output become less reliable signals that somebody has been doing the work for years. There was also evidence that some improvement survived when the system temporarily went down. Workers with more exposure sometimes handled calls faster during those outages, even without live recommendations. The researchers cautioned that the outage evidence was noisy because outages were uncommon. Still, the result is consistent with something more valuable than temporary assistance. In at least this setting, workers appear to have absorbed some useful patterns from the tool. So there is a real optimistic case here. Assistance can sometimes help a newer worker move down a performance curve faster. But a performance curve is not a career ladder. A second randomized experiment makes that distinction much harder to ignore. From September through November 2025, researchers gave 1,174 adults a workplace-style business problem. Some had generative AI assistance, and others did the task without it. Without assistance, people with less formal education performed substantially worse on the measured task. With assistance, that gap shrank by roughly 3/4. If an employer only saw the finished work, the difference between the groups suddenly looked much smaller. Then the researchers took the assistant away. Part of the underlying gap came back. The polished assisted result had not become equivalent unaided capability. People who used the tool heavily while still putting sustained effort into the task performed better later without it. Heavy use without that engagement produced strong immediate work with less evidence of durable learning. That distinction matters far beyond education. A worker can become faster at delivering the artifact before becoming better at understanding what makes the artifact right. And that changes the question a company has to answer. The valuable outcome isn't just whether the employee can finish today's assignment with assistance. It is whether today's assisted assignment leaves the employee more capable when tomorrow's problem is different. Performance can improve in one afternoon, while experience still takes time to accumulate. Now put that inside an actual workplace. Imagine a manager who used to hand a junior analyst the first draft of a presentation. The junior would gather the information, organize the argument, make weak choices, and get those choices corrected. The manager could have done the draft faster, but delegation transferred context as well as labor. Once generating that first draft becomes much cheaper, the economics of delegation change. The manager can still give the work to the junior and use the saved time for feedback. Or the manager can create the draft personally and move the project forward. Both choices can improve short-term productivity. Only one automatically preserves that particular learning repetition. A qualitative study inside a global consultancy observed both possibilities from February through September 2024. Some entry-level professionals used generative tools to move toward creativity, client interaction, and broader responsibility. At the same time, some managers kept tasks they previously would have delegated because those tasks had become easier to do themselves. The same capability was opening higher-level work in one part of the system and removing lower-level practice in another. The same tool can create a stretch assignment for one junior and remove a learning assignment from another. That is why the career effect cannot be read directly from a productivity number. Managers are not merely deciding whether employees use a tool, they are deciding which parts of the old apprenticeship survive after the tool makes some production cheaper. Procter & Gamble shows another side of that shift, but with an important limitation. Between May and July 2024, researchers studied 791 experienced professionals working on real product innovation challenges. Some worked individually, some worked in pairs, and both formats were tested with and without generative assistance. Individuals using the tool could match teams without it on the study's innovation task. The assisted professionals also crossed commercial and technical knowledge boundaries more effectively. For an experienced worker, that is a meaningful expansion of what one person can attempt. It suggests that existing expertise can become more powerful when access to adjacent knowledge gets cheaper. That is directly relevant to someone already 5 or 8 years into a career. Your advantage may shift away from producing the first draft and toward knowing what deserves to survive the first draft. Context, evaluation, client judgment, and consequence ownership become harder to separate from the value of experience. But the P&G participants were experienced professionals. The study tells us what assistance can do when expertise is already present. It does not tell us how a beginner acquires that expertise faster. A wider range of work is not the same thing as a shorter apprenticeship. And the most direct evidence on learning gives the optimistic story a serious problem. In a much smaller randomized study, 52 experienced Python developers had to learn an unfamiliar programming library. Some had an AI coding assistant and others learned without one. On average, the assisted group later showed weaker conceptual understanding, code reading ability, and debugging performance. The sample was small, and the experiment covered a narrow technical learning task. So this is not evidence that AI generally makes workers less skilled. It is evidence that assisted completion and human skill formation can move in different directions. The usage pattern mattered too. Developers who stayed cognitively engaged could use the assistant without the same learning penalty. The weaker outcomes were associated with patterns where more of the difficult reasoning had effectively been delegated. The risk is a worker who can ship the answer before learning how to challenge it. That risk becomes even more important when the surrounding organization does not change with the worker. A separate randomized field experiment studied 7,137 employees across 66 large firms from 2023 into 2024. Access changed activities workers could control individually, including reducing time spent on email, but researchers did not detect comparable changes in broader activities that required coordination with other people. Workers could save time without meetings, responsibilities, and organizational routines automatically being redesigned around that capacity. That is the reversal at the center of this story. A tool can change what one worker can produce before the company changes how that worker learns, collaborates, or advances. The optimistic outcome is possible. It just does not arrive automatically with the software. The economic reason is straightforward. A manager is rewarded for delivering the current project with the people and budget available now. Training creates a return on a slower clock. The employee may become more capable months or years later, and may even take that capability to another company. If a senior employee can now produce a first draft quickly, handing that work to someone slower can look like an unnecessary delay. If the saved time becomes another deliverable, the productivity gain is visible immediately. If some of it becomes coaching, explanation, review, and progressively harder assignments, the payoff is much harder to measure. That makes apprenticeship easy to underfund even when everyone agrees experience still matters. The organization can harvest the capacity today or spend part of it producing capability for tomorrow. Neither outcome is dictated by the technology. The crucial variable is what happens to the time and responsibility after production becomes cheaper. Does routine work disappear, while explanation, challenge, and ownership remain with the learner? Does saved capacity become harder responsibility, or does it simply become more output? Does a senior worker use the tool to create space for teaching, or to remove the handoff entirely? Those are different career systems built around the same capability. The cheapest workflow today can become an expensive training system later. That brings the story back to the worker who is already somewhere in the middle of the ladder. If you're around 31 and several years into a knowledge work career, this shift does not simply make your experience worthless. In several of these studies, assistance makes first-pass production easier while leaving judgment and accountability much harder to automate or transfer. A junior colleague may arrive with cleaner work sooner. Your job may increasingly be to see what the clean work is missing. You know which client objection never appears in the briefing document. You remember the project that failed because the elegant model relied on a bad assumption. You know when a technically correct answer will create a political problem inside the organization. Those things are difficult to capture in a polished draft because they were accumulated through exposure to consequences. That can make experience more valuable, even while some of the visible work that once signaled experience becomes cheaper. But it also creates a new responsibility for mid-career and senior workers. If fewer junior tasks naturally transfer context, somebody has to create another way for that context to move. Mentoring can become less about correcting formatting and more about exposing assumptions. Review can become less about fixing output and more about making the junior explain why the output should be trusted. A manager can move a capable junior toward a client conversation earlier, or quietly stop giving them the work that once prepared them for it. The worker in the middle of the ladder is therefore standing on both sides of this change. Their accumulated judgment may become more valuable, while the system that produces the next generation of judgment becomes less automatic. That is a career consequence, but it is not yet evidence of faster promotion, higher pay, or greater job security. The studies here do not measure those outcomes, and task evidence cannot honestly be stretched into them. This is why the senior pipeline question is still unresolved. We do not yet have a strong longitudinal comparison, following similar junior workers across different AI-enabled career systems. The useful comparison would separate teams that combine assistance with deliberate mentoring from teams that add assistance without redesigning development. Then it would track unaided judgment, task difficulty, responsibility, internal mobility, and promotions over time. Until that evidence exists, two confident stories both run ahead of the data. Companies cannot yet claim that assistance is reliably turning beginners into experienced workers faster. And critics cannot yet claim that automating junior production is already hollowing out the future supply of senior talent. What we can see is the mechanism that could produce either result. Performance, learning, and career progression are three different outcomes. The first is already moving in several workplaces. The second depends heavily on how people use the tool and how work is designed around it. The third remains largely unmeasured. That means the future career ladder may be shaped long before promotion statistics make the change obvious. When production stops hiding the training cost, somebody has to choose to pay it.